Hello, buddy. It's Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming here today with a new episode of Jmulls' The Beauty of Storytelling. And in today's episode, Final Fantasy XIV is in the batter's box as we break down the components of its story and explain why Final Fantasy XIV's story is so beloved and so good. Let's get right into this, and let's start with a quick breakdown of each expansion first. And moving forward, I'm going to avoid spoilers as much as I can. There will be very minimal story-related spoilers, if there are any at all. The videos themselves are going to show roughly the first-ish cutscene of each expansion, just to show the overall gradual betterment of the camera techniques, and because, in my opinion, it's a good representation of how they treat each story moving forward. So let's tackle it. A Realm Reborn is a ton of world building that is in effect all the way into Endwalker. By laying that groundwork, they're able to spend more time in the expansions of just telling the story of the world, since we are already acquainted with the world itself, and it can just build on the characters that make up that world. Again, this world building isn't only relevant to A Realm Reborn, we are still dealing with its ramifications into Endwalker. People really underestimate just how important A Realm Reborn is to the overall story. And let's move on to Heavensward. It's a total shift from A Realm Reborn, which may catch the player off guard at first, but it serves to set up the overall mindset of the expansion and grab players' attentions even more, because it doesn't feel the same as A Realm Reborn in terms of tone. It feels different, but just enough so where it still feels like Final Fantasy XIV, but it can renew interest in the narrative. It's like loving chocolate, so you try a different type of chocolate, and while it's different, it's still chocolate at the end of the day, but it's different enough to grab your attention. Stormblood itself takes the tones of A Realm Reborn and Heavensward and combines them. It has grim, dark, and emotional scenes, but it supplements them with lighter sections, more focused on comedy or smaller-scale conflicts as well. The writing also improves with time, not just in terms of narration, but in terms of character interactions. Scenes get more emotional due to improved camera work and tech, introduction of more solo duties, more compelling dialogue, and even better comedy, and we will tackle those elements later on in the video. Now let's quickly move on to Shadowbringers. I've talked about this before, but Shadowbringers takes what made the stories of A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, and Stormblood so good, and it amplifies on those techniques. More fantastical locations, great musical accompaniment, and timing, even funnier comedic relief at times. Wonderful and great antagonists, more elegant and concise world building, and even greater emotional scenes and character development. The story does not feel segmented or fragmented, which is a problem a lot of MMOs tend to face, where each expansion feels like it's a stark deviation from the narrative from the other expansions. That is not the case with Final Fantasy XIV. The story from the start of A Realm Reborn to the current patch story feels like a cohesive, ever-flowing, and developing story. Final Fantasy XIV is not afraid to be lighthearted and comical, but also grim and dark. They know when they need to mix it up, but in order to mix it up so the narrative still flows cohesively. Let us proceed to voice acting. An underrated aspect of storytelling, in my opinion, is the voice acting of the game. A good voice actor can add a new level of depth and immersion into a scene whenever that character is speaking, and in my opinion, the team that does the English VO for Final Fantasy XIV, for the most part, nails it. By utilizing an older sounding style of English, it amplifies the feeling of being in a fantasy world, but the majority of the main characters' VOs help add emotion and depth to each scene. A particular standout is a character named Emmett Silk in Shadowbringers. His VO, in my opinion, is god tier, and really helped drive home how excellent of a character Emmett Silk was. He added emotion and flair to every line of dialogue that added and emphasized the personality of that character. And for those who may play or want to play in Japanese audio, I've also heard phenomenal things about the Japanese VO, if it's like on par or even better than the English VO. And if that's your thing, then it's also there. But a lot of the same principles of what I'm talking about voice acting still apply there. And how, sure, You can have a story, especially in a video game setting, without voice acting and still have it be compelling. But you can add an additional layer of immersion and emotion to a scene by nailing the voice acting. It's a really underrated aspect of storytelling. Let's move on to another underrated aspect of video game storytelling, and that's the camera work. I want to keep this video as spoiler-free as possible, but the end of 5.0 and 5.3 are perfect examples of phenomenal camera work. Shadowbringers as a whole nails this aspect of storytelling. The camera knows when to pan, zoom in or out, and the right angle to maximize the effect and atmosphere of each scene, and to keep the player engaged. The camera work is a subtle part of what makes the end of 5.0 as excellent as it was. Combining great dialogue, VO, camera work, visuals, and plot development is how you tell a compelling story. And for those who have maybe watched a movie with great camera work, or have even played the end of 5.0 or 5.3, I want you to imagine a still frame for that entire scene, and not a camera that just panned out and doesn't move for that entire scene. And I want you just to imagine how much different that would feel compared to what we got in game. Camera work is incredibly important, and while it is often a really highly celebrated aspect of cinema, when we talk about video game storytelling, we don't really mention camera work all that often outside of gameplay sections if the camera is annoying. But in terms of cutscenes and narration, it is very important in my opinion. And honestly, it's been an aspect of Final Fantasy XIV's story that has been getting better with each expansion, and the quality of the storytelling and immersion improves because of it. Okay, let's transition away from the more mechanical aspects of storytelling and more into the philosophical nature of it. And let's start off with something that's very near and dear to me, and it's very important for me in terms of how to tell a story, and that's tackling character death. Because Final Fantasy XIV is not afraid to kill characters off when it's appropriate, and to keep characters around when it furthers the plot. This, in my opinion, is expert story writing and storytelling. The game rarely ever just kills a character for a cheap emotional response that a lot of other games tend to do, and if a character's story is finished, they will probably stick around to help other characters develop and further those characters' stories. Or will continue to show off the result of their own character development, which makes the time the game spent with that character and the trials and tribulations that they went through worth it. That is storytelling. That is payoff. That is how you develop and write characters, in my opinion. You don't just write a character, have their story finished, quote unquote, and then just kill them off because you have no more use for them. That's just, in my opinion, 90% of the time, a cheap emotional response from the player base, because you just got that player interested and invested in that character just to kill them off, just to get a cheap emotional response from that player. So you can say your story is emotional or something like that. To me, that is lazy. But Final Fantasy XIV doesn't do it. They say, you know what? We just spent all this time developing this character. What we're going to do is keep that character around so you can see the fruits of your labor, so they can help other characters on their stories. And so you see just all the work you did for that character, so you can see how it all paid off. You planted that seed of character development, and now you're going to see that freaking tree grow. And you're gonna see the fruits of your labor. That, to me, takes effort, and it takes passion. And it tells me that you actually care, and that you give a dang about your story and about your characters. And that, to me, is one of the best aspects of Final Fantasy XIV. By far and away. Just how they handle character death. They will kill a character if they need to, and if it's relevant to the story, and if it will further development and story of other characters. But they won't if it's just a cheap emotional response. And that takes effort. And that means something to me. Now let's talk world building. An underrated aspect of the game's story is how the characters also show up in a breadth of side activity and content. In terms of story, it adds to their development without taking up MSQ time, while also giving the player extra story and events to experience between MSQ patch drops. 14 has nailed the art of world building by being cognizant of the fact that people relate to humans and other human struggles the most, and uses that to give each new location identity and its own distinct culture. By giving the player a character-driven story, combined with memorable music and beautiful locations, Final Fantasy XIV gives personality to its world and the people who inhabit it, through both script writing and setting up the atmosphere. The game takes the time to develop each region's culture, while also giving side content that builds on things that were touched upon in the MSQ to further develop the world in each of these cultures. It's an important aspect for an MMO story, in my opinion, because the world itself is one of the major characters of the story. So if you don't have an engaging world in your MMO, then that's a massive detriment to the overall experience. But Final Fantasy XIV doesn't suffer from that. Hydaelyn and Eorzea itself are excellent places to be, and they have personality. And in my opinion, that's one of the main things that keeps people engaged in the story. Now let's talk about the Warrior of Light, your player character specifically, and how the Warrior of Light being an actual character is so important. An easy way to immerse the player in a game's story is by having the player play an active role in that story. The Warrior of Light becomes a known character in the world after working their way up from the bottom. They have relationships with other characters, ranging from friendship to mentors to students, mainly in the job quests, and rivals and enemies by having well-written dialogue and developed characters, like we talked about before, along with your player character interacting with those characters and being an integral part of the story and of those characters' other stories. It adds a layer of immersion into the story, since you aren't just fighting for other characters' motivations, but also your own as the Warrior of Light. Your character has motivations and regrets, and this is further driven home and amplified in the Dark Knight story, which is why I made a separate video all about the Dark Knight story and why it's so good. The side content and job quests help show your player get stronger in their respective job and develop a relationship with characters not in the main story. This achieves multiple things. It develops the main player character, world builds, develops both side and main characters, and can show other parts of the world, which fleshes out the world itself. It's subtly beautiful in how it handles, and it's something that can really only be tackled in an RPG because of the side quest system. And, in my opinion, more elegantly in an MMORPG. Because you have to wait for patches to drop so they can actually, make the story. Duh. But by having all these side content, in the wait for new story drops, it lets you just take your time and flesh the world out. Baja, Evilise, the Alexander raids. Just pick something, and it probably develops the world if it's a major piece of side content. Eureka, Baja, Zadnor, all of these things. All the raids as well. It's really freaking important, and it's something that can only really be done in an MMORPG, and in my opinion, Final Fantasy XIV nails this aspect. Let's talk about how the game references past events. This game knows its lore and knows its history and is unafraid of it, and it's a beautiful thing. The game is cognizant of older lines of dialogue that's stuck in the memories of players and is unafraid to reintroduce them as dialogue options for the Warrior of Light. This, for mainly a silent protagonist, is utterly brilliant for a couple of reasons. 1. They are not overused. 2. They reappear at key moments where the lesson or memory of that line of dialogue is most relevant. And 3. This makes it so the player character seems like they have grown or been changed from their journey, remembering things others have said along the way, and taking the lessons or morals instilled on the Warrior of Light to heart. It's a wonderful character development because of how sparingly but well executed it is used. Alright, so a major thing for long-term stories, and especially for MMORPGs, is continually raising the stakes. So let's talk about it. Raising the stakes versus raising interest. Sometimes a lot of stories feel the need to continually raise the stakes in order to one-up what came before, and for it to retain consumer interest. While that can work, it isn't a surefire way of telling a compelling story if you don't care about the stakes to begin with. Many have made this critique of game stories before, but just putting the world or universe at stake doesn't automatically make it a compelling story. Final Fantasy XIV does raise the stakes over time, but since you care about the world, the people, and the villains, it can tell a compelling story. 14 has multiple antagonists, factions, with varying stakes. Some are mainly region or city-state focused, while others cover the world or specific regions. 14 realizes that the size of the stakes isn't as important as how much you care about the stakes themselves. It can go from a giant threat to a smaller one and still be compelling, because you care about what that smaller threat threatens, as well as what that giant threat threatens. Endwalker has the chance to be exceptionally compelling, since it's a world-level threat, but we generally care about the world, because what we have done from A Realm Reborn, Heavensward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers, including patch content and side content to further develop and flesh out that world. A world-level threat feels gigantic in that case because you care about the world and the characters that inhabit it. That is how you tell a compelling story, and that is how raising the stakes can be compelling, when that larger stake is composed of all the stakes you cared about from before. Now let's talk about payoffs. One of the most important aspects of a story, especially one that is long form, is being able to nail big payoff moments. Whether they be sad or exciting, crescendos in the story, the writers need to know how to make them worth all the build-up that has gone into that singular moment. I say this with all sincerity. Final Fantasy XIV has some of the best payoff moments in any game I've ever played. They achieve this through either a combination or as a direct consequence to everything I have covered in this video up to this point. They give immense satisfaction or emotion, and without directly spoiling anything, they serve as great climactic moments to both smaller and larger story arcs. By bringing back elements from previous storylines that make sense given the context of the story, and subsequently give beautiful transitions to future storylines. They do this by having, meanwhile, in insert location here, scenes at the end of expansions or patches that serve to foreshadow future events. So when we wrap up Shadowbringers in both 5.0 and 5.3, we get additional scenes that hint at where the story is going moving forward. So we still get the satisfaction of the current story ending, and we get that conclusion, but the game then whets our appetite for where the story will go next, and in the future. So we are left feeling satisfied, yet wanting more. It's a simple storytelling mechanic, and generally is memed as, next time on Dragon Ball Z, in the cartoon or anime world. But this method is used so often because it works, because you get teased at the future events, and you want to see what happens. These meanwhile in X location scenes are generally used sparingly either, like I said, after a .0 expansion launch or at the end of a patch's story. Combined with trailers and expansion cinematics, the writers of Final Fantasy XIV know how to get their players and fans excited for future storylines as we all now wait for Endwalker, but they also know how to pay off big story moments and how to pay off expansion storylines. And that makes Final Fantasy XIV's story feel like an actual RPG story and feel like a story that had thought and time and passion poured into it. And that is what makes Final Fantasy XIV's story so special and so memorable. It's not just a matter of payoffs. It's not just a matter of knowing how to raise the stakes and raise interest. It's not just about reintroducing old characters or any other singular component I talked about in this video up to now. It's about combining all of these various elements to create a cohesive and compelling story that the player base cares about, that makes the side content you do matter more because players care about the story, and about what happens in this world, and about the characters that inhabit this world. It's all about making the player and making the consumer care. And the story of Final Fantasy XIV does that beautifully by combining all these aspects together into a harmonious whole. And it's a beautiful thing. If you haven't played Final Fantasy XIV's story, or know about it, do yourself a favor and do it. It's long. Do not get me wrong. It's a long freaking story. But it's so freaking good. And it earns that length. So, thank you all for tuning in for this video. My pleasure for making the video. I love making videos like this where I can just talk about an aspect of the game that I particularly care about and that I particularly love. And the story of Final Fantasy XIV is one of those things. If you like the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you like the video and you want to see more content. I know I would appreciate it. Stay safe out there. Have a great day. And I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. So, thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure for making the video. If you like the video, please make sure to leave a like and comment down below about what you thought of the video, about any aspect of the story I talked about, or maybe aspect of the story I haven't talked about. Or leave your suggestions for future video ideas, or storylines, or games you would like me to cover on the channel going forward. And please make sure to subscribe to the channel as it helps me out big time. Thank you all for tuning in. Stay safe out there. Have a great day.